functional interdependencies have to get broken down. And even the smallest of organizations that you have, many of you are leaders of small teams, please, you've got to let your people realize that none of them owns the success of their job. So the first thing I want to make sure everyone's clear of is whether or not you have a cogent team that reports to you, or whether or not you're an individual manifesting something in the world and you have to interrelate with a group of people to do that, this will be equally as valuable for you, I hope. So with that in mind. Just a quick backshot. What's interesting is that my work started, well, I was a chief marketing officer in a couple of big companies, Deloitte and Starwood. And I observed in both of those organizations, in one organization, incredibly high-performing team. In another organization, a group of individuals that worked as silos. And if I go as far as to say not only silos, fear-based silos, where people were competitive. It was a very challenging organizational design. And it's interesting because it is possible to have dysfunctional teams and still have functional businesses, right? But that, I would say, it has been possible. It's my belief and research that the world of transformation that is upon us today, the competitive pressures that are upon us today, the market pressures of what our consumers demand of us, are so extraordinary that it really is going to be impossible to do business in this work world without an entirely new set of work rules. And I'm very excited about exposing to you some of the research that we've been doing over about 20 years as they've been evolving. What are the new work rules in a new work world? Now, when I wrote Never Eat Alone, it was a book on networking. It was a book on building relationships. We spin ahead today, and what we find is that getting things done is how you manage networks. I don't know if any of you work in very large organizations, but in large organizations, we really, and that's most of my work, we coach the turnaround of General Motors coming out of bankruptcy, the transformation with Dr. Jim Kim of the World Bank, Verizon in its transformation. We're about to start with Delta Airlines. Very, very large organizations facing disruption and transformation, looking to create executive team effectiveness that is allowing them to meet those transformational pressures. And what we find is, the most important thing is that we're finding the interdependency is what's defining business success today. If you're going to redefine your product, who leads that? Is it the chief product officer? Is it the head of sales who's out in the marketplace dealing with the product as it's not selling? Is it the marketing leader who's been doing marketing research? Right? Is it the technology person who knows what your systems can support? And the reality is that, as you can imagine, none of them can effectively lead the product transformation. They all have to do so interdependently. But that's not how we're hardwired to work today. Right? And so that's what we're going to be talking about. I want to land, this is actually a story I typically use at the very end of my talk, but I want to start with it for a very particular emotional hook reason. A number of years ago, I wrote my second book, Who's Got Your Back? And the idea was, if I was the guy researching networks, how important are close relationships with a small group of people? And what does it mean to, and what we found was that your personal success can be predicted by whether or not you have 3 people in your life who truly have your back. Now, define somebody who has your back. Somebody who tells you the truth, no matter what. Somebody that is supportive of you and will celebrate you and will be there in your corner, no matter what. An individual who cares for you and is so generous that when you're not around, they're thinking about your agenda and activating on it. Right? Intimacy, generosity, candor, accountability, the 4 cornerstones of any great relationship, are an individual that has your back. Now, when we did our research, 50% of Americans said that no one has their back. 50% of Americans say that no one has their back, let alone three. And interestingly enough, of the 50% of Americans who said that no one has their back, 60% of them were married. Now, yeah. Well, think about this. How many, and I just think about where I come from in Pittsburgh, how many housewives in Pittsburgh have dreams for themselves, and their husbands don't give them the credence of caring about those dreams or aspirations beyond just how they think of them as a functionary in the house. I still see that when I go home to Pittsburgh in our own environment. And if you look at America in general and in the world, now the study was only American. I don't know, but I do feel that the perception of loneliness is rampant in the world. And I don't believe that the increase in electronic connectivity is soothing that. In fact, to some extent, it's exacerbating it because it creates an expectation that individuals feel that everybody's life is better than theirs and they're not worthy to engage with these glorious people having glorious lives that they see on the platforms. Does that make any sense to you? Yeah. So, let me tell you a little story about my mom. So when I was writing Who's Got Your Back, I remembered that my mom used to have a group of ladies that she hung out with all the time. And I called her and I said, Mom, tell me about the group of ladies that you used to hang out with. And she goes, oh, you mean the card club girls? And I said, yeah, the card club girls. And the only thing I remembered was whenever the card club girls met at our house, my dad and I got kicked out. And so I loved it because Dad and I got to go have coconut cream pie, at the diner, and he and I would sit around talking to his old buddies, that he had grown up with. And it was like the best thing for me. I had all I know is that, Mom had, and the other good news is there were lots of snacks left over that I got to come home to. So I was really pumped all around for my mom's card club girls. But that group of ladies met every month for 45 years. Every month for 45 years. And I asked my mom when I was writing the book, I said, Mom, I have an idea. I believe what you had was something I'm writing about. Tell me a little bit about the importance of that group of ladies to you. And so she told me a story. She said, well, you remember when your dad was unemployed? And my dad was unemployed a lot. In the steel industry in the 70s, it was fairly eviscerating. The whole industry was wiped out. Towns to this very day have never recovered. Pittsburgh's recovered. CMU and a lot of wonderful places to work there. But the original towns that were the steel mills, the coal mines, etc., the very same people, like my parents, are still sitting in those little towns destitute. Their children have moved away, and it's quite sad. And he says, remember when your dad was unemployed for 6 months? So when you were unemployed for 6 months, you lost your unemployment insurance, and you were offered by the government welfare cheese. That was your supplemental governmental support. And my mom said, we never had to eat welfare cheese because those girls would always cook extra and bring it around when I would call them and tell them that your dad was out looking for work. They would bring food down, and I would pretend that I was able to make a dollar stretch and put real food on the table because of those girls. And she said that when your aunt died, and it was funny because all of them were aunts. None of them were related. One of them was a related aunt, but it was like Aunt Wilma, Aunt Patty, it's Aunt Rita. She's like, when your aunt died, we didn't cancel Card Club because your aunt didn't want to. 2 days before she passed of breast cancer, we sat on her bed and said goodbye to her and played cards. And when your dad died, she was telling me, she said, everybody got back to their lives in a couple of months, and I understand that, but I didn't want to leave my house, she said. She said, those ladies made sure I left my house every day for 4 months until I was ready to leave my house on my own, right? And so when I heard that story, first of all, I was so blessed my mother has this. In fact, that's them now. That was them when I brought them to the book tour. And And it's so funny because my mom used to be a cleaning lady. And when I bought her a new home, she told me the neighborhood she wanted to live in. And I bought her a home, and I didn't know why. She wanted to live next door to the meanest lady she used to work with. And now anytime there's a special occasion, she always makes me send a limo to pick her up. So this limo drives up in front of her house. And I swear to God, I think she waits until the lady sees her But anyway, so with this black SUV shows up to drive the ladies into Pittsburgh. And unfortunately, there's only 3 of them left now. My mom says that it gets difficult because they have to keep changing the card game every time one of them dies. And then she says, one of these days, one of them is going to be sitting there playing solitaire thinking of the others. Right? I tell you that story because, again, I know how blessed I was that my mother had that. But then I really looked in myself and I said, I didn't. I didn't have that in my life. I didn't have that tribe. And I then really reflected, and I thought to myself, I'm not the kind of leader that's building that in my company. I had a lot of work to do. And that went down a path of about 6 years of research for how to be the kind of leader that creates the kind of team that won't fail in a radically interdependent world of today. And that's the work that I wanted to share with you today. We all know what's going on in the marketplace. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the transformational pressures are crazy. And I have a whole riff on this I just did for the Wall Street Journal the other day. CEOs are scared. Even the disruptors are being disrupted by a lot of venture money being thrown at the disruption of their business that have entirely different scorecard than going businesses have to. And customer expectations are crazy because all of us, the blessing is all of us have the opportunity to have free at our fingertips all the time. These were services that some of our companies used to get great profit margins from, right? So it's quite a challenge in the transformational pressures. And it's interesting because a lot of people think about the millennial population as a challenge and roll their eyes. I don't. You know, I joke, I'm like, how dare millennials demand purpose in their life? How dare millennials want to be cared for in the workplace? How dare millennials be a type of individuals that, that want to think of their careers as fluid and flexible and balanced, right? What a beauty, we gave that up a long time ago. How dare them? Well, I believe we've now set a beautiful new hurdle for how do we have to serve in the workplace. And I think that great leaders are going to have to figure out how to step up and not roll our eyes at millennials, but actually step up to the demand of workplace that frankly cascades from millennials to gig workers. Your best employees won't work for you anymore. Your best employees will demand to work for themselves and sell you their time at a significantly higher rate by the hour. And it's already happening in software. Now, that doesn't say, that's not for the mainstay employee, but your absolute best are going to wake up and realize, and therefore you have to recruit them and engage them every day, if that makes sense. All of this leads to the more important thing, is that hierarchy and control and traditional org design has been blown up. Just for what I was saying earlier. And it's very interesting because I do work for very large organizations. And then I go and I look at startups who are high growth and they're coming fast. And then they go and hire some HR person from a large organization to come in and replicate an org design that is exactly the damn reason those individuals were being disrupted. I mean, I'm sitting now in conversations at Uber, at Airbnb, et cetera. They're having exactly the same problems in their organizations and potential being disrupted as these large organizations are, because they haven't fundamentally rethought what org design looks like. So I have a belief, and there isn't technology created for this, and there needs to be, but I have a belief that the future of organization design is goals aligned to networks. For every goal you have in your organization or in your life, you then ask yourself, who are the limited number of individuals critical to achieve that goal? And around that goal, that's the team. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, that has nothing to do with reporting structures. It has nothing to do with org design of tradition. So how does one lead an organization where you really don't worry about hierarchy, control, and org design, but you lead an organization around goals aligned to networks of people who are to achieve that goal? And as a result, you would be in multiple teams. You have multiple goals, there's multiple teams, and you'd cross against those. Is this making sense to everybody? Now, there are some things that don't get done then in that order. One of the things that wouldn't get done would be performance reviews. Where would performance reviews and feedback come? Because the old work contract is that you get your performance review and you get your feedback from your manager. And that's where the contract is, that I'm to get feedback from my manager. You don't get your feedback from your peer. That would be rude. You actually get it from your manager, hierarchically. Now, the fun thing about this new world is you'd have to recontract. That feedback would then come from the network of those you're working with. Does this make sense? So there's a number of literal new rules you would have to contract with your organization to afford a working world where, because you do have to have feedback. The funny thing is today, managers could barely give you appropriate feedback anyway, because most of our managers are not even seeing the work that we're doing because we're on so many dispersed teams. And so, again, this idea, and yet every piece of HR software is orchestrated around hierarchy, right? And every HR leader immediately goes to the org chart. So we really have to fundamentally rethink a lot of the rules of where things come from. Strategic direction comes from top down, right? There's very little co-creation of strategic direction. Development comes from top down. So we have to have a new set of rules around that. What we found is that when you start to run your organizations without thinking about org design, but you start running your organizations thinking more about relationships, there are 4 primary places where making this change matters the most. And any of you who lead an organization could pick any 4 of these to start. One of them, and the most obvious place to radically accelerate relational competency, is anything customer facing. Think about what Tony Hsieh did in his call centers at Zappos, where he made his call centers a customer intimacy opportunity. Call centers in the past used to be something you'd try to get people on and off the phone as quickly as possible. And now they celebrate people who can keep the customer chatting and engaging lovingly. And it's actually the elongation of the call along with a positive customer feedback that gives people higher rewards, because he sees the customer intimacy as the better. We have redefined it at one British chemical company. We were able to create $1.4 billion of new pipeline and closed $750 million of deals in 18 months just by coaching strategic account teams how to think more relationally with their strategic partners at their companies. And in a sense, to create co-elevating teams where instead of selling to somebody, you created a co-elevating team, a collaborative team between yourself and the client, and you co-created solutions together and you built relationships together, and it radically changed the revenue in a B2B world. We've done this at Accenture now, Verizon. Many B2B companies have learned that the acceleration of customer intimacy and co-creating teams using this model has been very successful. The next two places where I'm going to spend more time is on the last one, but functional interdependencies have to get broken down. And even the smallest of organizations that you have, many of you are leaders of small teams, please, you've got to let your people realize that none of them owns the success of their job. None of them owns the success of their job. And that if you have a head of marketing, if you have a head of product, if you have a head of technology, they are nothing more than a co-elevating, co-creative team in service of the business outcomes. And that's what I want to spend our time on today, which is what does it mean to redefine, and typically I'm going to use the executive team as the medium for that. What does it mean to redefine the rules of an executive team's behavior to shift them into a team that could truly be transformational? So, for the sake of this exercise and for our work together, what I want you to do is I want you to, either you have a company with a team, and that makes a lot of sense, and we'll just say that's your team. But if you don't have a company with a team, then I'm going to suggest you have a mission with a team, and that team may not be identified by you yet as a team, but there's a team around your mission that you need to go form. Does that make sense to you? Yes. Right. So the question, and then now we'll talk about how do you build that team that allows your mission to succeed exponentially. So I want to make sure everybody's got something. So I want to start with just a couple of minutes in your pods of 3. Earlier on, we divided everybody up into 3. I want you to just share with each other what your mission is and what your team is. So my friend here has been taking a year or two off after having left his very successful doctor practice back in Australia and trying to figure out what's next for him. It might be more of a struggle for you to think about who is your team, given that you're still trying to figure out your mission. But for the sake of this exercise, pick a mission. Maybe it's the birthing of the new organization that you came up with yesterday. He came up with Gayfest. Which is A-Fest for the homosexuals. And so, maybe that's what you're thinking about, and that's what's your team around it, but it's up to you. Others of you have bona fide teams out of New York, hundreds of people in your organization. That'll be an easier one. What's your mission? What's your team? Just share it. I'll give you just 2 or 3 minutes to solidify one. If after the end you still haven't gotten one, then raise your hand and let's make sure you have one. We'll work through it with you. So in a group of 3, yes?
What mission are you talking about?
A vision or a goal, something you're trying to achieve, and who's the team you're trying to achieve it with. And raise your hands if you need me to come over by and help you. Let me just get a couple of shout outs. Who's got a mission in a team that's pretty clear to them? Yes, sir. What's yours?
Can you just wait for the mic?
Yeah.
Okay, so in my company we roll out renewable energy plants. So my mission is to roll out solar energy across different geographies.
Great.
My team is a team of 10 people, expanding to 20 people.
Beautiful. Done. That's easy. Perfect. Do you have yours? Yes. Here. Can I have it? I got it. Okay. Oh, you got it. Okay, great.
So I have an external CFO business. So we play the CFO role external to the businesses that we work with. I'm dealing with accountants, which it sounds like you've had a lot of experience in that space. Yeah. So my mission is to get them to develop their communication skills.
And who's your team?
I've got 10 people on the team right now. Yep.
Great, good. Anybody else? A little more esoteric? Those are all pretty easy.
Yeah, hi. Does that work? Yep. So I got a team across many regions, like from Asia, Japan, Africa, Middle East, Europe, and our mission is to influence government to reduce carbon emission and making everyone to be more self-aware of
Beautiful.
how you use your electricity, your energy, and influencing the way you use it.
Great. Do you want to do yours? Do you have one?
I do, yes.
Let's go for it. I'm just trying to get examples from different types.
So the mission would be to improve the life quality of the gay community by facilitating authentic connections, and there would be quite a team to build.
You still have to build your team.
Yes.
Great. So he's got a mission. He's going to build his team. Yep.
What if you're a solo?
Right.
And my mission would be to build a team.
That's great.
Is that an okay? Is
That's
that
fine.
a viable mission to build a
Perfect.
team?
Perfect.
Okay.
You'll start with the recruitment of the first person, and then
Right.
we'll talk about how to co-create from there.
Yeah, because I'm a one-man show.
The lady behind you. And then we'll come on back.
Hello, my name's Mary. I'm a Grammy-nominated recording engineer and radio producer, so my mission is to put beautiful music out into the world, and I work with a team of other producers, radio hosts, and musicians who come in to the radio station in Chicago, and we put out live music, and I record classical music albums.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay, does everybody get the idea? You have a mission and a team. Good. So I'm going to assume that you've either got one right now or you'll keep iterating it a little bit as we go, which is fine. Now, the most important thing that we as team leaders, and I'm going to call all of us team leaders for a moment, but I'll deviate from that language a little bit as we speak, and you'll see why. As team leaders, your job is to lead the co-creation of the success of the mission. Your job is to lead the co-creation of the success of the mission. I think there was an historical time when it was expected that you would bring the strategy. But for somebody that is, for instance, in the music industry, and you have a vision, what you have to recognize is that the first person you invite into your team, you're inviting them into their team. Do you understand that? The first person you invite into your team, you're inviting them into their team. Nobody wants to join your team. Nobody wants to be on your team. They want to be on their team. So get out of your mind that this is your team that you're inviting people to. Now, if you happen to be in an organization, you're a CEO and you have hierarchy, you've got a little harder work to do to pull that off. But your success will be when you're able to invite people into their team. Could you imagine the engagement level that would go up? Could you imagine the amount of Saturdays and Sundays people would put into the work? Could you imagine the risk-taking and the strength of voice that people would have, right? If it was their team. Often when we have a vision, and we do this a lot when we're building movements. Our businesses are two things. One, we coach executive teams. That's what we do. We don't coach executives. We go in and we work with an executive team for 6 months to redefine the rules of that executive team. We go in for 6 months, and we're there for a dinner and a day, once a month for 6 months. And during that period of time, they totally reboot all of their belief systems on how they are as a team. And we leave them with the sustainable practices and rituals that allow them to be what we call a co-elevating team moving forward. The other thing we do is we build movements inside of organizations. So an organization like General Motors that has 250,000 souls and needs to radically change behavior across the board needs movement leaders in their organization, and those movement leaders need to enlist fellows and peers in joining a movement of change in the organization. Similar, by the way, to the quality movement of the 70s and 80s and 90s, TQM, Six Sigma, Black Belt. Those were movements that were led by black belts of Six Sigma down at the plant. It wasn't central quality control that transformed quality. It was the black belt down at a plant that re-engineered process. Your job as a leader is to ignite movement leaders in your organization that co-create the movement that needs to occur. Who knows better to define the movement of change of the sales organization than activated role model salespeople who are committed to redefining the way they sell, and then turning around, helping and coach their peers to adopt a new way of being. Does this make sense? Movement leaders, yes. Sure. Can we have a mic runner?
Are there a few features or attributes that make someone feel like it's their team as opposed to your team? Like a few?
Yeah. So we're going to actually go through the actual process. But yes, the first thing is that it's co-creation. And there's nothing worse than buy-in or consensus. Buy-in is bullshit. Buy-in means you've cooked an answer and you're trying to sell it to someone. Nobody wants to be sold your shit. Buy-in is probably one of the least effective forms of transformational thinking because it assumes that a limited number of people at headquarters or in your little head was able to create a transformational answer without radical inclusion. Inclusion is what's going to give the breakthrough answers. Yeah.
Who makes the decision and how do you resolve conflict?
Yep. So we'll get to the conflict piece. On the decision making still there is still authority in organizations. I'm not suggesting today that the organizations that I go into, they already have the traditional hierarchy. I'm trying to get them to no longer lean on the traditional hierarchy, but in the case of a tie vote that needs to be broken, that's the one place where traditional hierarchy is valuable, right? The downside is when that hierarchy is leaned upon for the collaboration, meaning it doesn't get co-created, it emanates from the hierarchy. So you as a movement leader, as a leader in organizations, you're a movement leader. Your job is to be enlisting others to co-create. What I often say is that when you have a vision for something, you should say to yourself and say to other people, to your question earlier, I've got an idea that I think is 30% baked. Would you join me and us in helping get it to 60%? That should be your standard operating language when you birth a new team or birth a new mission. I've got a 30% baked idea, and I'd like your help to get it to 60. And we'll never get it to 100 because the market change will always be constant and transformational pressures and demands will always be constant. And therefore, we'll just have to keep inviting other people and iterating. But to get us from 30 to 60, I need your co-creation. That's the level of I don't know humility that's needed to be a good leader today. Yeah.
I have two questions. Firstly, with the co-creation. So I have a company of 500 people that grows to 800 people when we're in season. Mm-hmm. And just one example, we recently, well, I'd say about 3 years ago, we kind of redid our company culture. Mm-hmm. And we co-created it within a team of people from human resources, senior leadership, various departments, things like that. But then we have to still roll it out to the other 500 people. So how do you co-create with a team that is that long, that big, and not still have to get buy-in at some point?
Yeah.
That's first question. I have a second one too.
Yeah. I don't believe in centralized creation of cultures.
Well, we have company values, departmental values, and then your personal values.
Yeah. And I totally get it, and I'm absolutely certain in your case it's working beautifully. And so I have no...
It's not. That's why I'm asking.
I have no insight. But I find those exercises a total fucking waste of time. And I'll tell you why. First of all, the first thing I always do when I go into an organization is I ask somebody to dust off whatever they call their company culture and values, etc. And then I do a statistical audit that asks the organization whether anybody believes they are living to those principles and values. And I've never seen an organization rank above 50%. So failure, right? So something tells me that we are not engineering the right culture in the right way. So what we decide to do is we do something that we call behavioral engineering. I also try to avoid words that I think have become overworn, overused, and meaningless. So culture, unfortunately, I think is meaningless. Even though it's a buzzword today, I think it's meaningless because of how poorly cultures are being led today and being created. So I'll give you an example. If you take a 250,000 person organization, like a big automotive company, coming out of bankruptcy, you ask the question, and this is, I call this the killer question, is worthy of writing down. Which fewest people changing which narrowest set of behaviors will allow us to meet our strategy? Which fewest people, because it's tough to change people. So which fewest people changing which narrowest behaviors will allow us to meet our changing the narrowest of behaviors will allow us to meet our strategy. You ask your executive team that conversation, facilitate a dialogue with your executive team. Ask your executive team, if there are 5 people in this entire company whose behavior had to change, who would they be and what's the behavior change? If there's 200 people in our company that have to change their behavior, which 200 people and what's the behavior change? Do you understand the simplicity of that? Now, the bottom line is, it's probably the CEO. It's probably 3 or 4 of the executive team, right? And what I generally find is that it falls into those categories. Almost every organization needs a behavioral engineering of how you're touching customers. There's something about how you're touching customers and the way that some portion of your population is touching customers that you need to behavioral engineer, right? And by the way, one of the things you'll notice is I'm not necessarily prescribing an organization-wide culture. I would rather engineer behaviors for outcomes. And that actually bubbles up to me to a successful culture. I do believe, of course, in a successful culture. And you'll see the attributes of what I believe to be a successful culture. But I want to engineer them in specific roles that move the financial needle for the company. Because nobody wants to spend time or take serious anything that they don't think has a direct impact on the business at hand today. So when you go do the cultural exercise, it's a nice separate exercise, but it's not necessarily the engineering of what's going on that's driving the needle which pays us and gets our bonuses, etc. So I generally find that we need to engineer very specific behaviors against the strategy. So customer-facing, you might find that if you go down and look at the sales organization, the customer-facing organization, you start asking the question, what behaviors have to change here? You then engineer those behaviors, and what I generally find is that there are a set of individuals at each role in your company that are the behaviors or are leaning toward the behaviors that you want everybody in their role to have. Those are the people you want to bring together to co-create the new role definition. They become your movement leaders. What we're doing right now in a very large dispersed franchise organization this is a group that similar to Weight Watchers, where they have coaches in boxes all over the world, and those individuals are earnest, lovely, wonderful coaches, but they're not being sufficiently commercial, so the growth isn't there. So you find literally of 6,000 of these people, all you need is 10 to 15 of them who actually you're seeing do a decent job being commercial in the role. You pull them together and empower them to figure out what the 30% answer is, while they share with each other to crack the code of being in that role and being more commercial. You document that process and you export that. And a part of that is when I do want to make sure we get to this, when you're leading those teams, there's a set of attributes to lead the team that are crucial, and they exist around candor, one of the things I'll say now on cultures, the worst eroder of shareholder value is conflict avoidance. If you have conflict avoidance in your organization, you are a shitty leader. And I have had plenty of it in mine. There is no room for conflict avoidance in organizations. You need to have full transparency, full fluid dialogue, full risk-taking, full feedback, full interdependency of, I've been noticing something in your role and I think you could be better at it and here's what it is. That's the high-performing teams. If you look at a sports team, the coach isn't just the coach. The coach is the team when they get into the locker room talking about the plays with each other. Right? High-performing teams are not alien in the world. They actually exist in sports teams, but some of those attributes don't come in. So candor has to be critical. When you pull that 15 people in that particular role together, you give them and coach them and facilitate with them a set of rules that they're going to live by, including unadulterated candor. Right? And I'm going to go through all of the attributes and ways to coach those attributes into those teams. Yeah. And then the gentleman in the blue who was waiting, sorry. If you get it to the gentleman in the blue. Yeah, we got it, and he's got this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I have an IT company in the Netherlands with a little over 20 people. But we are facing, you said you have to avoid conflict. But when
No, I didn't say that. I said that avoiding conflict
avoiding
is the thing
conflict
that kills
yeah.
organizations.
Yeah, but at the moment we are facing in Europe, also in the States, I think, there's a shortage of people in IT, programmers and technicians. And I didn't avoid conflict, but it is costing me people. Mm-hmm. And people you don't get back.
Yeah. So I'll give you the formula as we go through this. Candor, if candor is the North Star of a successful team, managed conflict is the North Star of a successful team. There's two ways you can successfully have high candor in organizations. One of them is only hire assholes. And Ray Dalio, in his book around the principles, he has the luxury of hiring assholes who are very well paid and absolutely are competitive, evisceratingly candid, etc. They have no problem with that. Oracle is a company that hires people who can deal with this shit. Microsoft used to be. That was the Microsoft culture. Amazon at the very top. That group, it's like water off a back. They argue. But by the way, when you get big, you don't necessarily have the luxury of scaling with a strategy of hiring assholes. Dalio has 250 people. He can and he's paying them all millions. He can afford candor as a primary value. The other way is that you build enough of a relationship contract between people that they come to realize that holding back candor is doing a disservice to somebody you care for. Now, some organizations who have high degrees of care in their organizations, they end up not pushing that care because they're Midwest polite. They don't believe in this. They have not activated an actual contract between the employees where candor is actually doing a disservice. So when I coach an executive team, I will say to the executive team on this topic of candor, if any of you believes that one of your peers could improve something they're doing, is it high or low professional behavior to withhold that information? It's low. I actually feel that somebody withholding that information is stealing from shareholders and stealing from your peers who could have benefited from your belief system, right? Now, if you tell that to the group and you get everybody to say, yes, that is low professional behavior, and then you say to the group, And are we interested as a team to recontract and have high professional behavior, and that we will say to each other feedback if we think it could benefit the other person? Let me just finish this little segue. People will say yes. Now, there's a couple little extra pieces to this contract that you need to add. The next piece to this you have to add is, and when I give you the feedback, you have to recognize that you don't need to do anything with it. See, the problem with feedback was designed hierarchically. It was designed when your manager would tell you what to do differently, and you had to do it. When you're doing feedback peer-to-peer, you've got to let the pressure out of the feedback by telling people that feedback is a gift that you could re-gift or do nothing with if you'd like. That's very important. When you're working in an organization, you say, all we're doing is giving you the data. You can do whatever you want to with the data. I don't control you. You don't have to do anything with it, but I love you and I'll give you the information. Right? The other thing is that I actually run an exercise. I call it an Open 360 in a team. An Open 360 is where if you had 10 people in your team, you always start with the CEO, and everybody goes around first and says, you know, Shane, what I most appreciated about you last quarter was X. And then you say, Shane, what I most appreciated about you last quarter was whatever. So we do this once a quarter. Everybody says to Shane what they most appreciated about Shane. Then we go around and say, Shane, in the next quarter, because I love you and you are so important to our success, I might suggest. Now, the power of that is if you were to say, Shane, what I thought you did shitty last quarter, Shane would now be on the defensive to defend his action in the last quarter. But if you just say to Shane, because I love you and I think you're so important to our success, next quarter I might suggest, that is giving him a gift that he can do whatever he wants to with it. And then when he's done hearing all the feedback, he gets to pick one or two things he's going to work on for the next quarter, and that becomes his contract of development with the team. We didn't assign it to him. He just chose it. Does that make sense to you guys? Now, doesn't that feel like a much more healthy way to make sure we're now having the candid without the pressure that would traditionally come with hierarchy? You had a question? By the way, I'm enjoying this with the questions. It's allowing me to bounce all over my presentation, which is perfectly fine. If you all are enjoying this exchange going in and out, I'll do that, or I could get through the presentation and we do the questions at the end, but I'm fine with either. Yeah. Why don't we do one more question? We've got 20 minutes, and I'd like to get to the content as much as possible, and then, but this is great. I mean, I enjoy it. I'm really enjoying the repartee, but yeah.
Sorry, last question then. Going back to something you said before, where you co-create as a team as opposed to get buy-in. One of the problems you have, I see in the organizations I've been part of, is when you sit in the team, you still have the hierarchy from the organization, and decision making gets weighted by the hierarchy. So if the CEO says, well, this is what I think, it gets a higher weighting than if a junior person on the team says, well, this is what I think. At the end of the day, as you think about it, it doesn't get equally weighted. So it's
in companies that have created sufficient psychological safety and have put a premium on candid dialogue, I don't see that happening. When I watched Jamie Dimon's team at JP Morgan, in fact, we did a study right after the financial crisis, the last financial crisis, and trying to understand why some banks invested in risky mortgage-backed securities and why others did not, and how did some banks fail and how did some banks succeed. So we went through and we found executive teams of all members of the banks. We interviewed 3 or 4 members of each executive team. And what we found was that there were one particular bank that ended up surviving but barely. The executive one of the executives we interviewed said, you just didn't critique somebody else's plan because it would be putting a bullet on your back. The CEO and the head of new products came up with the product. It seemed to make us a lot of money. And while some of us felt a little uneasy, we just sat there and let it happen, like tumbleweeds rolling in the distance, right? But at JP Morgan, I talked to a very young man who was the CFO at the time. He was a very young man. He was probably in his 30s. And he was one of the youngest guys on the team. And what he said was, I remember that exact conversation. And I was one of the youngest people, but it wasn't even me. It was one of the younger members of the team that raised his hand and said, hey, wait a second. I just don't understand how this works. And he was able to say, I just don't understand how it works. At that point, there was this dead silence. And an older member of the team said, because it fucking doesn't. And they ended up having a half-a-day brawl, and they didn't go there. But it was one of the youngest members of the team, because the youngest member of the team knew that his CEO, Jamie Dimon, celebrated audacity and speaking up in meetings. Right? So one of the things that, and I'll get to this in the conversation, one of the tools that I use is something called a Yoda in the room. We all know the fuzzy little Yoda character. I love that thing. And what I love about Yoda is the wisdom in Yoda. Here's what I fundamentally believe. Every team has the wisdom of Yoda in it. Every team has the wisdom of Yoda in it, but not in one person. And if you as a CEO, as a leader, would walk into a team and say, we have the wisdom of Yoda, we absolutely can crack any code. But we'll only do it if we extract the inclusive ideas and we have the debates and even broaden our team to a broader network of individuals that can give us ideas that we wouldn't even have inside of our own damn company. Because remember, your teams shouldn't just be your corporation. Your team should be anybody you need to achieve your vision. And if getting audacious ideas from outside of your team, why wouldn't you expand your team to advisors? I'm not just talking about paid consultants, but we should all have individuals that are bona fide members of our team, right? And so one of the things I do in the middle of a meeting is before any meeting I have, I pick 3 people who are the Yodas. And it rotates. And then somewhere halfway in the middle of the meeting, I stop and I say, this is when I'm facilitator. I stop and I say to the Yodas, okay, Yodas, what's not being said right now? And I've told everybody in the room, we've got to celebrate them taking risks. They could say that what isn't being said is that, you're quite angry at this because it's going to take budget out of your pockets and you don't buy into it. But somebody else could offer that up. And you could say, no, that's not true. But we're celebrating the audacity of that individual to speak up. Celebrating this little ritual of having Yodas speaking the truth. One of the things I did with John Chambers at Cisco when I was working with his team is we had this voting app in his leadership meeting. He had a leadership meeting of 200 people, and I was coaching the team. And halfway through the meeting, I just stopped. And I said, John, may I try something kind of daring? And he allowed me. And I said, how many of you feel that the topic of conversation right now is a favorable topic of conversation that's going to lead us strategically to where we're going? And how many of you feel opposite that? And it was 80% felt opposite that. And this was like one of the pillars that the conversation was being built around. Now, it threw John for a loop, but he's smart enough to say, okay, great, now I know this. Right? This is the kind of, and I wish software would be created in WebEx or, whatever. It's like a bullshit meter. Like during any meeting, we should have a bullshit meter that just says people think people are full of shit. Because what's in your head is not helping the organization. All right, so let me get through here. Number one, we were talking about this, and I'll get into more detail, is you have to be leading your team in co-creation. Number two is, we've been talking about this, no conflict avoidance. Candor is crucial to all team effectiveness. The next thing is the development journey. If you're a leader of a team, whether it's formal or informal, you should contract with this group of individuals that while you're working together, you are all going to grow like a motherfucker. Like, that's a part of the new contract of work. It should be. It should be that while we're working together, we're all going to go to our A game. And you literally contract that. Once you get a group of individuals contracting that while we're working together, we're going to go to our A game, you start to open up the aperture for people to give each other feedback. Does this make sense to you? But this is not what happens. Most executives, once they get to a certain stage, they think that they're using their competencies for success. Very few executive teams feel that they're at 40% on their way to being better. And now the next question is, it's a shared humble co-development journey. So you've got to contract with those other team members that you yourself have a lot of growth to do, and that we're going to get each other there. It's not an individualized exercise anymore, and it's not an exercise between the individual and the CEO. It's a co-development journey. And the first thing that I would do, if you haven't ever done this, is next team meeting you walk into, and I don't care if it's an informal team, of a group of, musicians or whatever, if you've been helping to move a movement forward, every once in a while walk into the room and say, do me a favor, have everyone write down on a piece of paper, please, what one thing could I do that would make me a better leader of this team? And if you don't even want to call yourself a leader because it may be an informal structure, you might say, what one thing could I do that would allow me to serve this team better? Tell me one thing I could stop. Tell me one thing I could start, please. And then you let them hand it in and let somebody read all of them out loud in front of you. And even though you think half of them are full of shit, it's okay. You say thank you, and you pick two things, and you say, got it. These are two things I'm going to work on. I mean, this is the kind of modeling of a learning environment that leaders need to begin to practice. And it's so easy. Once you get in a refined model, you can then start to say to the team, you own each other's success. You can start to step back as a leader and say, I am not the hub and spoke of everything anymore. I can't be. You want to bounce ideas off of each other? Do it separately before you come to me. If you have problems with each other, take them to each other. One of the things that I absolutely say as a red flag rule is that nobody in the organization is allowed to talk about another person behind their back unless it's one conversation before you say it to them directly. It's perfectly fine to go to somebody and say, gosh, I'm really having a tough time with Shane. I need to have a conversation with him. How do I have that? And get some coaching on your way to having a conversation with Shane. And that's one of the contracts I make with new teams. I say, can we agree for 30 days not to talk behind each other's back? Can we agree that not only is it low professional behavior, that it frankly is a violation of integrity? And if everybody agrees, then we check in a month later and say, how many of you talked behind each other's back in some way? Knowing that you will, I think it's okay, but are we realizing we're violating integrity? You just did low integrity moves. It's very important. I use integrity very specifically when coaching teams because I feel that this new work contracts, we right now in companies, we violate integrity all the time. I'm not talking about cheating on expense accounts. I'm talking about lies. I'm talking about talking behind people's backs. I'm talking about withholding information that you think could be beneficial to somebody's program because you're too cowardice to do something about it. You're either coward, lazy, indulgent. Those are the I've got 8 of them, primary excuses for not being, courageous. Indulgent. Some people just like disliking people in the company. You've gotten to the point where relationships so spoiled that you revel in your dislike of that individual. And that indulgence, I see it all the time in organizations. But we've got to call this stuff out as just low integrity behavior. And this is not the dialogue that's had in most companies. We don't call it low integrity. We don't equate it to cheating on expense accounts. But we need to. Now, the one thing that I can say is I don't care if you sit on another person's team or you own the team, you can make this change happen. Everything I'm about to show you is something that you could walk in and say and do little pieces of, like the Yoda in the room exercise. There's nothing that would stop you if you were on a team to say, hey, I saw this fun exercise called Yoda in the room, and just to increase the candor and conversation that we have, let's pick 3 people, and halfway through the meeting, let's pause and see whether or not we're being conflict avoidant on stuff. Anybody could offer that. Now, if you have a real asshole as a CEO, then maybe that wouldn't be allowed, but almost everybody could get away with these. My point is, the new book is called Leading Without Authority. Anybody can take leadership. And one of the things that I say to an executive team is that, and you should say this to your teams, if the meeting isn't going the way you want it to go, everybody's job is to get it back on track. That's just a whole different contract. Usually it's the person who called the meeting, it's their team. But no, in this new world, we don't have time for that. Everybody's job is to get the meeting back on track. Everybody's job is to raise their hand and say, I think we've gone down a rat hole. Everybody's job is to keep the team effective and the mission moving forward. So what you're seeing with me is you're seeing a much more dispersed authority into the team with a set of distinct rules. Now, these are the areas. This is a sample. We've created a diagnostic tool that we give to hundreds and hundreds of teams. And I picked one question out of each. I've got the full diagnostic tool here. I'd be happy to share. But this is what I wanted, and I don't have time to do the breakout exercise in your groups of 3, but let me go through these for you. For collaboration and inclusion, all team members welcome the collaborative engagement of others in helping solve their business challenges. How many of the people on your team welcome the collaborative engagement of the team members on their business challenges? And it's interesting because a lot of people get very defensive. And you've got to recontract that. You literally have to say to the team, if we're going to be a high-performing team, everybody in this room has got to be open to hear the feedback of other individuals. And if you're not, get the hell out of here. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone has to take your feedback. You have to hear it. You get that distinction? You were not moving to consensus. Just because people disagree doesn't mean that we have to create mush and satisfy everybody. The head of IT is still the head of IT. The head of product is still the head of product. That person has final decision making after they've gotten the benefit of unadulterated full candor. Now that person makes a decision. Now, if that person makes a decision repeatedly, ignoring data and information, then the CEO may make a different decision on who they have in that role. Or it could coach them outside of the room to say, you're not listening to the feedback and it's having a detrimental effect. But the key contract here is to get the feedback in the open. I'm trying to think if there's any other on the collaboration piece. This is a little audacious, but what we have seen is that on your executive team, the people on your executive team have to think that their primary team is your team. So when somebody says, how's your team? They will often be thinking it's the people that report to them. The reality is, to really make organization change occur, your team is the highest team that you sit on, not the team that you lead. Because it's at the highest team that you sit on is the team which makes the most impact at shareholder value. And you need to consider yourself a leader of that highest team you sit on, even though you're not the formal leader of that team. Again, all of these are very distinct. And just one of the things I'm doing is I'm writing a book on this topic of this coaching we've been doing for 10 years. And I'm going to roll out a practice. I do a very elite practice with this business. I coach this business for just CEOs and executive teams of some of the biggest companies in the world. We have a ventures group that coaches it for smaller organizations, and we do that for smaller amounts of capital, but some equity. I want to blow this business up big time. And I'm looking, and if anybody knows him, I'm looking for a managing partner of this business to run and to take this business more ubiquitously. So one of the things that if any of you knows of anybody who is a great business person, is not looking for a job, I'm looking for a partner who will run and grow this business at scale. So I would love to get any impact there. Okay, candor. All team members share openly with each other, even when it's risky to do so. And I'm going to show you a set of data at the end of this that will show you what the spans are of typical teams. The one thing that, there's another question I put up there. All team members are willing to give input to each other in service of the business, even when the topic is outside of their area of expertise. You'll cross the lines. It's a very important question. Elevation. All team members are committed to elevating each other by offering, these are important, feedback on business practices and performance, as well as each other's professional capabilities. It's one thing to give feedback on the way, your process. I'm head of sales. Hey, marketing, I think you should be collecting slightly different data. Okay, I'll listen to that. Hey, marketing, I feel like your team has been ineffective at delivering on X, Y, and Z. Right? The third and most difficult is, hey, CMO, I think your leadership needs to be changed. Right? So there's different levels of feedback that one needs to contract in an organization, and they're not all equal, but they're all equally as important. You've got to be able to give feedback on process. You've got to be able to give feedback all the way down to competencies. All team members are open about their areas of growth and constantly seek to develop themselves both personally and professionally. All team members of this team are accountable for shared goals. And this is important. So if one person on your team isn't performing, the worst world is that individual is sort of left out on a little raft by themselves and everybody's just happy it's not them. Right? In some decent companies, people will say, well, I'd be happy to help. In high-performing teams, everybody knows it's their job to get them there. That rarely happens. Where literally every person knows that if some division is ill-performing, they own that group's success. Which means stop the staff meeting, spend 50% of it re-engineering what they're doing. Spend your time with that leader, coaching and figuring out what the issues are. It's just not a part of the contract today. In the world where transformation wasn't upon us every day, we could afford just to let one group get a little bit down, and that's the CEO and their problem. Everybody has to own each other's success. That is a new contract. That's a new contract. Now, underlying all of this is you have to have relationships. The stuff I did with you the first day, those intimacy exercises, personal professional check-ins, sweet and sour. There's that wonderful question that I always ask at my dinner parties when I'm coaching a team. What experience of your past do you think defines who you are today? Don't ever do dinners anymore that aren't curated storytelling. It's a waste of time. I have a whole list of 8 questions. What experience of your past do you think defines who you are today? What do you want your legacy to be that you're afraid you might not achieve? Right? You can come up with these questions. It's funny, you can go to even like some of the love questions. What are they, 36 questions of love? I just saw those the other day. I was like, I'm going to steal some of those for teams. It's just open, vulnerable questions. What it's doing is what we're trying to do is we're purposefully engineering empathy, which gives permission for all of this tough stuff I'm talking about. And then here's where we were. So the average team, when I start working with them, on their collaborative abilities, they're usually on a scale of 0 to 5. They're usually at a 2.5. And with focus after 6 months, they can get to a 4.3, using their time collaboratively and engaged. Their candor, by the way, this is hundreds and hundreds of Fortune 500 organization teams. 2.4 can get to 4.4. Agility, 2.6, that's, we didn't talk much about this, but agility is such a crucial, agile leadership is such a crucial element. Monthly sprints to strategic outcomes, we can get from 2.6 to 3.7. Agility is one of the more difficult things of organizations to embrace. Accountability, but that's accountability peer-to-peer, starts out around 3.4, you can get to 4.1. And the relational commitment of not letting each other fail as a peer group, developing each other, owning each other's success, 2.3 to 4.7. Whether or not you're actually activated as a developmental group, 2.8 to 4.3. The point that I'm making is that if you're a leader, these elements I've been talking about, it's your job to be the active recontractor. You need to be the active recontractor of these distinct behaviors. Now, one of the things I do is I use, and I'll give you a hint, just use the staff meeting. Don't talk about behaviors in the aggregate. Talk about how you're going to re-engineer your staff meetings. Because staff meetings is your practice ground. Think of the staff meeting as a scrimmage opportunity. You got your team on the court during the staff meeting. They're all there. Getting them to be candid in that room, they're all there. Getting them to hold each other accountable, they're all there. Getting them to be supportive at the dinner the night before, they're all there, right? You can absolutely use that medium as your coaching ground for when they're not in that room. I don't know what you expected from today, but I hope you got something that you can use.